virtually. We're being brought to you by the Green Fair Organic Cafe Market and the plantbaseddiet.org with Mike Young. Our two sponsors are Mom's Organic Market and the Evolution Vegan Academy. We are here today with continuing the conversation with Chuck Carroll from the Exam Room podcast. And we're thrilled to be bringing Dr. T. Colin Campbell. Everybody knows Colin Campbell. He's been my hero since I watched Forks Over Knives and his book Whole, the low carb fraud, the China study, and he's going to be talking about his upcoming book that'll be coming out this fall. So welcome, Colin, and Chuck, thanks for your patience in doing this all day podcast. I hope you're hanging in there okay.
Oh, are you kidding me? I live for this. This is, this is like getting a free education. This is the greatest thing in the entire world. So thank you for having me. Dr. T. Colin Campbell, I can't begin to tell you how excited I am to speak with you here at the virtual Fairfax Veg Fest, as well as on the Exam Room podcast. I think that this is really going to be an extraordinary interview. Let's start by asking, first of all, how are you right now, given the pandemic? How are things at your house?
It's an interesting question. It's also a very personal question, obviously. I'm of the age that is at the highest risk, as you know. I'm 86. I'm not embarrassed about that, but I'm 86. But at the same time, I'm also quite healthy. Thanks to consuming a plant-based diet for the last 30 years.
For sure.
And so, yeah, I'm in pretty good shape, as is my wife.
And we were talking just before we started. I'm glad to hear that. We were talking just before we got started about how there really hasn't been, specific to COVID-19, a whole lot of information yet to come out between the connection between the severity of the virus, the outbreak, and nutrition and how people are eating. We know about comorbidities and we can kind of draw some conclusions there, but really at the end of the day, that's just a hypothesis. But I understand that you, years ago, have actually studied the effect of diet on a virus. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you know?
Yes, this comes from our study in China, the comprehensive nationwide study that we did at that time. That's been the subject of my book, The China Study, that was published now almost 20 years ago. But in any case, in that study, we measured lots and lots of things having to do with the relationship between diet, lifestyle, and mortality characteristics, essentially. And in fact, New York Times called it the most comprehensive study ever done in the history of medicine. I think it almost still holds that record in a sense. So we measured lots of dietary things having to do especially with nutritional characteristics. We also measured at the time 4 viral diseases. Well, at least that was a kind of rough approximation of these diseases, people dying from those diseases. But one of them, hepatitis B virus, we're studying some considerable detail. And I know there's obviously some specific effects on different viruses. Some would say works on one virus, doesn't work on another. Of course, that's sort of true. But at the same time, viruses, in terms of their infectivity, have some common features, very much common features. When a virus, for example, invades, our body, for example, the body goes to work and tries to form antibodies. That's one of the first things characteristics that happens. And that's across the board, essentially. And it either succeeds or doesn't succeed in forming an antibody. In the meanwhile, the virus is doing its dirty work, which unfortunately, it's quite different for different viruses, of course. But the principle is more or less the same. And so what we did in China with the hepatitis B virus was to look at possible nutritional characteristics that might be associated with the presence of antibody as opposed to antigen. We had methods to measure both characteristics of that virus. And we found something really interesting as I look back. And this incidentally involved a population of 8,900 adults. So it was a big study. It wasn't just a little study on the side. And what we found was that measuring nutritional characteristics in various and sundry ways, in terms of, let's say, some nutrients, in terms of food intakes, in terms of, let's say, the consequences that one might see in the serum as a result of consuming different kind of viruses. And so we had access to quite a lot of data. And I had a chance to go back and then re-examine that this time. And what we found was that the consumption of plant-based food, as indicated by, for example, the consumption of vegetables, for one thing, or as the consumption of, let's say, plant protein is another, or dietary fiber, or dietary thiamine, which is obviously comes from plants. We had these different characteristics, and those things I just mentioned, we saw a statistically significant relationship with the formation of antibodies. And in one case, it was highly significant, the probability of 0.001 level of probability, incidentally, so it's really quite significant. In contrast, we also had a set of data too that related to the factors that are associated with antigen presence. That's an active virus, obviously. And so we had this comparison, it's these two sets of data. On one hand, we had nutritional characteristics associated with the antigen presence, and the second set of data with the formation of antibody. At the same time, we also had information too on the principal outcome of that virus. That's primary liver cancer. So we had mortality statistics on the outcome. We had mortality. We had evidence on the antigen presence as well as the antibody. Fascinating, fascinating. And I'm talking to. I haven't published this. We have it in a big monograph. I really should, by all accounts, to publish this in a peer-reviewed journal. Have a nice, clear, clean analysis. But we have the statistics already now available. What we found as plant food is increased in the diet, we see a greater conversion of the antigen to the antibody. I mean, it's really quite impressive. And just to sort of to confirm, some of these kind of relationships, we obviously saw a highly significant relationship between hepatitis B antigen and liver cancer mortality. So everything just kind of fell in line. And I would suggest, because this is, as I say, there's a lot of common features with this virus, with any other virus, each having their own endpoints in a sense. What we saw in the hepatitis B virus situation, I'm going to suggest with considerable confidence that we have enough evidence to make a projection for what people ought to do with the COVID-19 virus as well. And I think I keep listening. In fact, I get quite upset listening to the news, especially the so-called experts talking about this. They're talking more and more about antibodies and antigens, and quite frankly, they're missing the point. None of them are considering the kind of information that we have, which is dietary and nutritional characteristics. I'm excited about it.
I would think that should that information get published in a peer-reviewed journal and it makes a big splash, I do suspect that it would make a significant splash, especially what we also know, just kind of from a lay perspective, not being a doctor myself, but I do know, having hosted the show now and speaking with so many experts such as yourself, that a plant-based diet can really significantly improve all of these comorbidities, these underlying conditions that we hear so much about with this disease, these underlying conditions that make the severity of the symptoms so much stronger. And now you're coming on board with data that you've had for many years that backs up this hypothesis. I want to go back to that study that you did, the China study. And for those who aren't familiar with it, when you were examining these people and they were eating the plant-based diet, can you give us an idea of what their menu looked like? How restrictive was it? Did you have them on a very set menu, or was it you give them certain parameters and as long as they adhered to that, they were okay?
No, that's what you're referring to, perhaps it might be described as an intervention study. In other words, you give a group of people a certain specified kind of diet, compare it with another diet, if you will, and then record the information. That we didn't do that kind of study. This was an observational study where, in fact, we actually looked at the nutritional characteristics and lifestyle characteristics, if you will, in a total of 170 villages in rural China, plus another 32 in Taiwan. So we had a huge, robust cohort to work with. And then we had ranges. We had ranges of, let's say, nutritional experience or viral exposure, ranges of experience and all these things. So we went from a low of, let's say, almost next to nothing in terms of animal protein consumption, for example, up to a high of a level that still is only about 1/10 of what we have here in the West. And so it was really, it's correlations. Now, one thing you may not know, you probably have heard this. Some of the evidence that we're getting from the human part of the study is, of course, based on correlations. Okay, but the correlations are sufficiently robust, if you will, in terms of statistical significance because of the size of the population we had, 8,900 people, adults. But in any case, the correlations that people get concerned about, want to criticize, they'll say correlation does not infer causation. You may have heard that.
Mhm.
And that's true. That's true. Everybody says it. But unfortunately, they're leaving out one really important link when they make that kind of comment. Namely, correlation does not infer causation if, in fact, we are intending to search for a specific agent or a specific cause of a specific disease, okay? And that's understandable. That's understandable. If we say some nutrient components related to breast cancer, for example, just to give an example, and we identify one nutrient as being related or not related, then we can't infer that that particular agent is really responsible for that particular outcome, okay? That's a given. We always can understand that. But quite frankly, that's not the way that nutrition behaves. And this is what people are missing. Nutrition is the nutritional effect is not the result of single nutrients affecting single outcomes. Nutrition is the effect of comprehensive nutrients working together through comprehensive mechanisms to produce a whole array of responses. This is a sort of a very different worldview. But I've been working on this for some time, and I refer to it as the whole food plant-based diet, okay? When you do it that way, then you look at correlations. You see something. You can look at, a whole host of correlations, let's say, for example, and to see if there's consistency between, let's say, certain dietary patterns and certain disease outcomes. Now, all of a sudden, correlation does infer causation. I'm sure you'll be talking to a lot of people, they'll say, no, it can't be. No, I would disagree with them vehemently. I'm confident of that interpretation. The correlation does infer causation if we sort of hypothesize, make the hypothesis in the right order. So that's the kind of study we did. And we had correlations of varied correlations that we could examine statistically and see how they go. And so what we saw is this pattern emerging. Wow. As we approach a plant-based diet, and in rural China, by the way, that was kind of interesting and quite different from this country, for example, because in rural China, they weren't consuming at that time. This is done back in 1983. They weren't consuming very much animal-based foods at that time. The highest county were still, quite a bit lower than what we do. And so they weren't consuming very much animal-based food. And so we were examining a range of animal protein intake or animal food intake, a fairly narrow range. And so when we are seeing an animal protein effect in a population like that, I'm talking about an effect that occurs with a fairly low intake of animal food. And that makes it even more powerful and more exciting because they see it that way. Wow. And then contrast that way, let's say, with plant food intake, and that's the kind of data we ended up with. I would suggest it's really quite robust.
Let me ask you this. Given the enormous amount of animal proteins that the typical American consumes, is it any surprise to you then that this country has been the hardest hit with the COVID-19 pandemic?
I'm not surprised at all. Good question. Our diet is as poor as it almost can get in many cases. And not only because of the consumption of animal-based foods, but also because of the consumption of the so-called processed foods. It's mostly salt, sugar, and fat, that sort of thing. Because in both cases, the animal-based food, the reason that it's significant is not just because of any nutrient in the animal-based food. Protein is one, saturated fat is another, and so forth. But it's not just because of the animal food itself. As we increase the consumption of animal-based foods, and considering the fact that total food consumption is a zero-based sum, as we can increase the animal-based food as a proportion of the total calorie intake, we decrease the consumption of plant-based foods. So when we look at correlation, for example, of, let's say, animal food with whatever outcome, we're really looking at a combination effect of the animal-based foods on one hand, which stimulates disease formation, and the lack of adequate protein or plant food intake, which only adds to the effect. So this whole idea of consuming plant-based foods, in my mind, is actually more robust than is generally talked about, and it's based on really substantial science. That's where I come from. I should add, just for the listener here in this case, and they probably know this, I came into this field 65 years ago when I went to graduate school at Cornell University. And I did my doctoral dissertation, and subsequently my early research career really was focused on the idea of what I believed that everyone else believed, that the more animal protein we consume, the better off we're going to be. I mean, animal protein was the center of the diet. We all knew that, generally translated in the form of let's eat meat, milk, and eggs. And I was raised on a farm just west of Washington, by the way. And so that was my background. And so I arrived at some of the views I now have over the years, strictly because of the science. I didn't come any, if I had any preconceived notions of what diet should do, it was exactly the opposite, what I now come to believe.
And that's funny. I know that you have a book coming out in the fall. I believe it is called The Future of Nutrition, that actually not just looks into the future, but actually into the past of nutritional studies. I want to talk to you in just a second about that, but I want to finish up with the talk about the coronavirus, COVID-19, with you by asking this. I was speaking with Dr. Baxter Montgomery earlier today, and he was telling me about the patients he's seen who have had COVID-19. They've been positive with it, and he treats them with a whole food, plant-based diet and has seen great success in that.
Fantastic.
And my question to you is this: if every doctor in America used that same method of treatment, that same course of treatment, how much less of a burden do you think we would be seeing in the ICUs, in the CCUs throughout America? How many fewer people do you estimate would need ventilators and things of that nature?
We're all guessing in this game, and I think that kind of question, as you might anticipate. But I know Baxter very well, Dr. Montgomery, and I'm happy to hear that he's trying it. That's really interesting. Insofar as the effect is concerned, from my perspective, without working with people like he does in the clinic, I would say that this effect would most likely impact those people who are testing positive for the coronavirus. It would be affecting them so that they wouldn't, therefore, go and have their difficulty, when the symptoms appear. So I'm talking about testing asymptomatic positive test people who then don't get the symptoms, let's say. Or if they do get the symptoms, it's going to be less problematic, which is also not so bad, because it may behave nothing more than like a fairly simple flu. So that's the individuals who most likely would be impacted, in my estimation, on this case. The second is more problematic and very speculative, and that is people who might be, let's say, around others who are symptomatic or who are positive, and they're worried about being infected as a result of this this social distancing phenomenon. The ones who are not yet affected, have no evidence of that, if they're consuming a plant-based diet, I suspect, and I must emphasize this is purely speculation on my part, that the plant-based diet may help to prevent those people from actually acquiring the disease in the first place. But let me label that, speculation for the moment. I think it's reasonable to make that suggestion, but this first one I mentioned, going from positive to antibody, basically, or that's the group who's going to be affected. And
so
yeah, one more thing I should say. You were asking about comorbidities before.
yes, sir.
You're quite right. Those who are most susceptible for suffering consequences, the severe consequences of infection, they're older, like myself, and 95% of those people, in the evidence we now have, both from Italy and New York City, for example, 95% of those people at least have been compromised by nutritional diseases. They've been eating the wrong diet. Okay, we already know that those people already are in that sort of situation. They can be treated at that point in time, switch their diet, and you can see fairly remarkable improvement in their health in a matter of days. We're not talking about, in this case, like weeks or months. We see these kind of changes happening within a day or two, such a drop in cholesterol. And those people who are most affected are the ones with heart disease, cancer, diabetes, et cetera, high blood sugar, high cholesterol, et cetera. Those people, if they were to change now, the moment they get positive, they were to change. I write this very sensitive topic, and I have to be careful how I say this, but my guess is those people are going to suffer much less consequences as a result of it, to answer your question.
Hypothetically, as a hypothesis, as you said, I would say that given what we know about how effective a plant-based diet can be in treating, reversing, preventing those chronic conditions in the first place, and knowing that they are such a huge factor in the severity of these COVID-19 cases, I really don't think it's too much of a stretch to go out there with you. I don't think it's a very far limb to agree with you at all here.
I know, I'm happy to hear you say that. I'm quite confident of the data that we have from China from 30 years ago. And we have a fairly robust collection of data to make this point. It's a different virus, yes, but we also, by the way, I should tell you, studied this in the laboratory. We studied the effect, for example, of high protein intake on the activation of the virus. That's a viral gene. The ability of animal protein intake, for example, to activate, in a sense, to cause the expression of that gene to actually form liver cancer. In that case, it was liver cancer, pretty serious consequence, obviously. And what we found, again, was very dramatic, that the high protein diet actually, if we kept on a low protein diet or non-animal protein diet, in that particular case, even though they had the gene to get it, that is sort of active, let's say, the virus is present, no cancer formed. It went from like 100% down to virtually nothing. Mm. So it was another addition. And so when you talk about comorbidities in this particular case, and 95% of those people have, they're sick with something else, nutritionally compromised diseases. Those people can benefit from the fact that their disease, their incipient disease they presently have, can be minimized. And so it's much less likely to become a comorbidity, I guess you could say. So it's working both ends of the candle.
And just to kind of put a capper on this point, I actually have some hard data in front of me. This is from the New York State Department of Health, leading comorbidities for COVID fatalities. And tell me yes or no if any of these cannot be treated with a diet. Hypertension.
Yes, this diet, one of the beautiful things about this diet, it reduces hypertension. Yes.
Diabetes.
Quickly. Yes, definitely. In fact, the effect is so powerful. And Dr. Bernard, as you know, at the PCRM, did some of that early on. that it shows that, in fact, the dietary effect is so prominent that one has to be careful to reduce the medication, at the same time, because otherwise it can go into hypoglycemic shock.
Hyperlipidemia.
Yes, of course, that's associated with heart disease.
Heart disease is the next one.
Yes, of course, same thing.
And then dementia, one of the lesser talked about ones.
Well, for a reason, it is lesser talked about because we don't have, enough data on that particular point. So I'm speaking now from my acquaintance with some folks who have been making observations, and we have to say sort of anecdotal, I think, at this point. But it's kind of interesting from what I hear. Again, I like to rely on the science that's published and been peer reviewed, et cetera, just like everybody else. But my guess is, yes, it's going to help that too.
So
my
and those are your top five. I think
Right.
that there's some pretty strong hypothesis to be drawn, especially with the first four. So very
Right.
interesting. I appreciate your insight, and I want to change gears a little bit here with the time that we have remaining. And I want to ask you about this book that you have coming out. I know that it'll be in the fall, so a number of months from now. But I understand that you actually did research on the history of nutrition research, correct? Is that kind of what I'm piecing together here?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that's a significant part of the book because have to go back in my own personal history on this. I started this kind of research in the 1960s, quite a long time ago. And then in 1980, which was, let's see, about 11 years later, I was invited to be on an expert panel on diet, nutrition, and cancer. And there was 13 of us, and it was a fairly prominent report at that time that came out. And I was one of the members of the committee who had actually done research in this area. And I talked especially on the role of protein in causing cancer. I took a hit for that, big time. I got a lot of pushback. I mean, including the proposal to have me thrown out of my society right at the time the executive council had nominated me for president. I mean, I'm talking about really serious stuff. And so I've had to put up with that sort of nonsense for a long time. That was in 1982. And in 1985, 86, I had a chance to do a sabbatic at University of Oxford in England. And at that time, I was experiencing this nonsense. Really almost heresy. It was vitriolic. And so rather than getting concerned about it and beaten down, I could have left the field, I think, at times, but I decided to go to the library in Oxford and London, 2 libraries in Oxford, 2 in London, just to look at the question concerning this question. Is there anything we can learn from the history of nutrition? And in my case, the history of cancer as well, because that was my specialty. Was anything that we might see in the history that might help to explain this vitriol that was occurring at that time, that still exists today? And of course, we can always talk about industry influence, et cetera, et cetera. But that wasn't a good enough answer for me. I wanted to know a little bit more about that. And sure enough, I got into history and went back to the late 1700s. And I wrote for myself quite a lengthy document on that, recorded a lot of that information. And so that today, now in light of other experiences, continuing to do the experimental research all those years, and also having a very substantial activity in policy development at the national level. I was on different committees and stuff like that, giving testimony before congressional committees and so forth and so on. So I had this opportunity of, being in the lab, getting that kind of information over the years, being in the policy arena, seeing how science is translated into public policy, and then adding the history to that. So my book is really about that. It's simply sort of say, okay, here's what I think I know. Here's the level of the experience I've had. Much of it great, very, very nice, but some of it really pretty nasty. And then taking that combination of experiences and going back and saying, hey, where did this stuff come from? Is there any basis for this? And I have to tell you, the history is that's one of the most exciting things I've ever seen. The history gives us the answer, in my view. I'm going out on a limb. I really think it's fantastic. And it really started in the late 1700s and emerged to some extent and started getting exposed to some extent in 1800s. But then at that point in time, we chose the wrong path. We chose the wrong path, and we ended up with a mess on our hands.
Do you know, like, was there one specific moment where we kind of came to that fork in the road and we went on that wrong path as opposed to a healthier journey?
Well, I don't know whether there's one particular point. I could name several probably, but I think the one point that probably struck me, I just mentioned, being on that committee and being rather, I became a bit of the public face of that committee to some extent, because the committee, the National Academy, had asked me to give testimony on behalf of the committee to a couple of members, a couple of House committees or Senate committees. And, I was out in the public, in a sense, quite a bit. And just the mere fact of seeing the vitriol, seeing the hostility, seeing what some people are willing to do to try to get me buried. Unfortunately, I had tenure at the time. And that's another issue I find as for me is extremely important. I had tenure from Cornell University. And so I was protected, I believe, because had I not been protected, I wouldn't today be here talking about this, I can tell you for sure. And so that in a sense was, that was a moment. That was a moment. And many more than that.
I want to go back, if you will, to the late 1700s. I've never looked at early nutrition research without giving away too much about your book. What exactly were they looking at during that period?
Well, I can tell you a couple of ideas. There was a physician at the Middlesex Hospital in London in the early 1800s. Young man at the time, he was being trained in medicine. They called it surgery in those days. But in any case, he, about 18 years of age, had some illness of his own. I'm not sure exactly what the nature of it was, but he decided to eat plants. He called it vegetables, and he experienced the results. And then he was a specialist in treating cancer patients. And so he wanted to try the vegetable diet on his cancer patients. And he was turned down. He was turned down by the authorities at Middlesex Hospital. You can also try spelling it. So I got my phone here. In any case, he was turned down. He went back to the second time, got turned down again. I actually retrieved those two proposals, read them. And so I saw that he wasn't getting any place. Well, he went on, he recovered his own health. He treated cancer patients over the years. I don't know, those records aren't available, but he went on to live, the rest of his life talking about this. And so then the question becomes, why were they turning him down? What's the issue here? Because at that time, we didn't have really any fundamental nutrition information really to speak of. And so that gets into a question of just asking that question. Why were people so hostile to this idea of testing a vegetable diet on breast cancer patients? So that's part of my story. I'm not going to tell you the answer. But eventually it emerged, some of that emerged in 1839 with the discovery of a nutrient called protein. And so the word protein, protein, comes from the Greek word proteos, which means of prime importance. I'll leave it, I'll stop there. I mean, so I'll just set the stage. But it's really, really interesting.
It really is. I had no idea that it dated back so long, so far back, because the earliest I can recall prior to speaking with you just now of anybody making that connection between protein and cancer was a headline in the early 20th century. I believe it was the New York Times. It said, cancer increasing among meat eaters. And so I'm thinking, wow, we've known about this connection for more than a century, but we're looking at almost 250 years, 230 years at this point, huh?
Yeah, well, it turns out that, I don't know 250, but a long time. This one I'm telling you about early 1800s, that's 200 years, yeah. But one of the key people who actually promoted a really critical idea that I now embrace is a man who published 14 books. He was a surgeon. By the time he was 41 years of age, he became a vegetarian. He didn't use that word at that time, but he published his first book in 1824, went on to publish others during the middle 1800s. And he espoused an idea that I'll be discussing in the book. It turns out that man is either my great-grandfather or his brother. I'm not sure which, but it's certainly positive. I mean, my father was named after him, and my son, who's now a physician, is named after my father. So we're carrying the name. I had no idea that because my father had immigrated from Northern Ireland he's in a farm family. And one of them went off straight off in the 1800s and became a fairly famous doctor. And I discovered that accidentally when I was in the Oxford and London libraries, his role in all of this. So it was exciting.
That must have been, yeah, quite the discovery. Who knew that it's been running in the family for so long, huh?
Yeah, we're all farmers. That's all we were. And we had one guy in my past decided to take a different course.
Let me ask you this as we kind of begin to wrap things up a little bit. You were talking about all of the pushback that you got in your career. And I'm curious, would you do anything differently knowing how much you've been able to spread the word about this and capture people's attention? Would you do anything differently to try to, I guess, avoid all of that trouble? Or was that kind of a necessary evil for you to get to where we are today?
Well, first thing I should tell you, I mean, that kind of hostility and stuff caught me a bit by surprise. I was very naive. I was the first one to ever go to college in my family. So, sort of getting into the science arena, in my sense, I thought was, a fairly civil thing to do. It was a fairly civil society. But when I saw that kind of thing, that surprised me. It was not pleasant. I paid a big price for that, a number of different ways. And as I look back, I would do it again. I would do it again in spite of the price I paid. Because it turns out, and there's another side of that coin, and that is that the stuff I saw and I experienced it, at fairly senior levels. In fact, the stuff I saw was not anticipated, but it was very acute and made me ask, unless I lost my mind in the process, it made me ask myself, why are these people being so hostile? People who previously had been so kind and so helpful. They thought I'd lost my mind when I started talking about in the early 1980s, started talking about the possibility that animal protein increases experimental cancer. I mean, you're talking about, lighting two fires at the same time and then poured gasoline on it. That's really what it amounted to. And so as I look back to answer your question, no, I would not have changed a thing. Yeah, I could have had some more good fortune, I guess, along the way on the personal side, but I just basically said, the hell with it. I sorry about that, but the fact of the matter is, it was a tough time, but nonetheless, I learned because of that. Had I not had those experiences, I don't think I would know today what I've come to know. It was actually those experiences. I should dedicate my book to that crowd, because it got me here to where, I was able to tell the story.
So you used it as motivation then to continue on with your work.
Motivation, yeah.
Have you heard from any of those detractors over the years who have looked at your research and said, well, geez, Louise, Colin, I'm sorry, you were really onto something?
No, not quite. Yes, actually, there are a couple earlier ones, older gentlemen who knew me when I was younger, and I've got a couple of letters that came my way when one of them was in his 90s. Both of them were in their 90s. Wrote me a very kind letter and said just more or less what you just said. Compliment me for sticking with it in a sense. But basically, no, the others that were involved in this, no, they passed, still really convinced that I had their words. This is words at one time on a real situation when they tried to throw me out of the society. They said I had betrayed my nutrition community.
Hmm.
And so therefore I deserved the treatment I got. They never retracted that.
It very much takes a strong person to stick to their guns when everybody's coming at them so heavily with pitchforks, and you certainly did that. And I will say that the world is a healthier place for that, and for that there is so many people who owe you a debt of gratitude. So on their behalf, I will just say thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just so happy to hear that, there are others, of course, now, especially in the clinical area, who are actually working with people now. Like you just told me the story about Baxter Montgomery. Baxter was a wonderful guy, by the way, personally and professionally. I love that guy. But in any case, he's taken this kind of information and others, many others, working with patients. I can only feel for those patients. I've met many of them. I've met these kind of people, and it's very gratifying. That's why I would never do anything different, just to realize that, some people had gained from this. It's very nice.
Well, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you for the past 40 minutes or so, and I can't wait until your book comes out in the fall. Again, it is called The Future of Nutrition, and I'm a history guy, so I love the fact that it's the future of nutrition, but it looks to the past as well, and I'm so thrilled about this.
Yeah, who said that? Was Lord Byron said something about those who forget the past are bound to repeat it, or something of that sort?
Smart man.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, Dr. T. Colin Campbell, again, thank you so very much for your time, my friend. A debt of gratitude, and stay safe, my friend.
Thank you for the invitation. Okay, bye-bye.
And coming up at the top of the hour, we will be speaking with Nelson Campbell, so don't go anywhere.